Many people get this wrong about the account of doubting Thomas. Have a listen.
In John's Gospel, Thomas is with the disciples, and he says, "Until I touch his wounds and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe." And then later Jesus appears to him and says, "Here I am, Thomas, come and touch me." At which point Thomas says, "My Lord and my God."
Yeah.
Well, we're never actually told that he touches the wounds. And so I'm interested in your interpretation of the story, because there's a reading of this text, which is that Thomas is saying, I need evidence, show me the evidence. This is as soon as Jesus is there in front of him and says, well, if that's what you really want, go ahead. It's almost like he immediately realizes that it's a ridiculous request, or it wasn't needed anyway. It's almost a message of the realization that it's not about the empirical evidence. Because otherwise I struggle to really get to grips with what the message of doubting Thomas could be. Because you're right to it's an astute comparison to this Job thing. Here's somebody saying hey, I want an answer here. And God gives him something, at which point he's sort of brought to his knees. What do you think is the message there? He says, "You have believed because you've seen me." And bear in mind, seen, not touched. "Blessed are those who believe without seeing." How are we supposed to read that as anything other than a message that, you should believe without evidence?
Please don't get me wrong. I think Cliff and Stuart Knechtle do a masterful job in this conversation with Alex O'Connor. But there was one thing that I wish they'd added in responding to his question. Alex seems to think that the most natural reading of the account of doubting Thomas is to communicate the moral lesson to believe without evidence.
It seems like a perfectly natural reading to say that Jesus is there saying, yeah, the best sort of approach to this is to believe without the empirical evidence.
But is this the most natural reading? I don't think so, and I think I can prove it. You see, most people stop reading at verse 29, but the next two verses are crucial in understanding what Jesus meant and how evidence relates to belief. Jesus just finished saying, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Then John immediately comments, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." When you read the whole context, it becomes clear that Jesus cannot be saying we should just believe without evidence. After all, John tells us in the next verse that he included this account of doubting Thomas so that we would read the account, the testimonial evidence, and believe in response. So unless we want to say that John is explicitly contradicting Jesus' words in the next sentence, then there must be another way to understand what Jesus is saying. And there is. When Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed," he isn't speaking metaphorically. He's not saying, "Blessed are those who have no evidence and yet believe." Rather, Jesus is talking about literal seeing. Jesus told Thomas, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." There are those who got to literally see the risen Jesus and believe. But that's not the vast majority of people, and both Jesus and John know that. In fact, that's why John included the account of Thomas in his gospel. We don't get to literally see the evidence and believe. Instead, we get to read the evidence and believe. It's ironic that people pick the story of doubting Thomas to show that evidence and belief are at odds, since John includes the story for one simple reason: to provide testimonial, eyewitness evidence for belief. As John says, "These are written so that you would believe." By the way, Jesus does chastise Thomas for demanding a face-to-face encounter, literal seeing, before he'd believe. But that's not because Jesus is advocating for blind faith. No, he chastises Thomas because he should have believed based on the testimony of his friends who did have a face-to-face encounter with the risen Jesus. This is consistent with the long ending of Mark, which reports that when Jesus appeared to his disciples, he rebuked them because they had not believed those who had seen him after he had risen. In other words, even though the disciples hadn't yet literally seen the risen Jesus with their own eyes, they still should have believed based on the eyewitness testimonial evidence. In a similar way, we don't get to literally see the risen Christ, but we do have the trustworthy testimony of those who did. And according to Jesus and John, that is adequate for belief.